All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. The weather is lovely. My name is Alexander Sitwell, and I used to live in England, where I studied theology at Durham University. Now, let me tell you a bit about the company that I work for and the company that has brought you this webinar. It's called English Book Education. Our company is divided up into 8 pillars, providing services such as continuous professional development for teachers, higher education, primary and secondary school education, preschool education, unique learning, which is our English language school situated in Vake, bookshop.g, qualifications, and the Kings and Queens Club. I am specifically representing the Kings and Queens Club, and I am the native speaker. So what is Kings and Queens Club, and what do we do? To become a member of Kings and Queens Club is to become part of a national and ever-growing book club. Working with over 40 schools, it is my job to visit each school once a month, where we will all have a discussion about the title which the students have been given. Currently, we have given away more than 50,000 books across Georgia for free. During these sessions, we will explore key themes, ideas, as well as connecting this all to the historical context and the author themselves. As well as this, students come prepared with a brief presentation about the title. The main idea behind what we are doing is to create an environment which gives students a genuine desire to read, to make them feel passionate about reading, and develop their critical thinking. As well as this, students also will work on the communication skills while doing their presentation, something we consider to be an invaluable skill. All right, now that I've introduced myself and the company, we can begin. So today's topic is books versus film adaptation of the book. Now, it's a very interesting relationship between these two things, because sometimes film adaptations can become excellent, but sometimes they can be dead awful. And I'm sure we all know some book adaptations that we've really disliked. Now, the agenda for today is, first we're going to begin with analyzing what is the difference between a film and a book as a medium. How are they different? How is it a different experience for the person who's either reading or viewing the film? What is the main difference here? Then we'll go further into the fundamental difference, which for me is action versus description. Films are far more orientated on action, while books are far more orientated on description. Then, having learned all that, we will attempt to design our own film scene. So this is going to be an interactive session. Then we'll speak about what causes bad film adaptations. And then to end it on a positive note, we'll think about what screenwriters can do to improve this relationship between the book and its adaptation. Because this is an interactive session, could I please ask you all to keep your microphones switched off? But if you have any suggestions or any questions during this session, please just put it into the chat box, and I will be attentive to the chat box, making sure I read everything you guys say as best as I can. All right. So to begin with book versus film, let's have some suggestions. What are some key differences between a book and a film as a medium? What could we say are some key differences? And while you're thinking, to get you started off, I'll give you a suggestion. When you read a book, there's more freedom to imagine things as you want to imagine them. So everyone who reads a book will imagine the scenery differently. There's a subjective element with a book, especially when it comes to scenery, how characters will look, etc. With a film, however, it's all set in stone. It doesn't give you the freedom to imagine the space because it shows it to you directly. Can we think of some other key differences, even just very simple differences between a book and a film? What might we say? Do we have any suggestions, some key differences? Okay, maybe even let's just strip it really down to the basics. There's different senses being activated. So when you read a book, you're only really using your eyes. With books, we have an opportunity to imagine everything. Absolutely. You have that freedom to imagine things as you would like to imagine them. You lead the situations. Okay. What do you mean by that? You lead the situations. And do we have any other suggestions?
It's all about your emotions, your imaginations, how you feel during the process. And once it is filmed, it's about director's idea, actors or actresses' interaction, and their own feelings given to you and to the audience.
Absolutely. So in the film, you're quite right. It's the director who leads it. It's the director almost plays a god where he manipulates every single detail. Whereas when you're reading, yeah, you have this license to imagine things. You can actually add things to the book. I mean, it depends on you. How will this or that happen? Exactly. Great point. Great point. Anyone else want to add anything to fundamental differences at all? I mean, another thing we could just say quite simply is that when you read a book, you're not using your ears. Films are much more, sound orientated. So I suppose it's more of an external sensory experience. Whereas when you read a book, it's more internal and it happens more in your mind, I suppose. Maybe. Okay, so let me split this up how I think we should split this up. The difference is that books help our vocabulary. Yeah, you're quite right. Although you can watch some films, especially sort of adaptations of Shakespeare or plays where it's very wordy. The interesting thing about this, listening and reading, a really interesting difference here is that human beings are actually much better at listening to words than reading words. If you think about our evolutionary history, writing is a fairly new phenomenon, or at least reading and writing has only been accessible to the masses in a very recent period of time. Whereas before that, we always relied on our ears, word of mouth, we told stories, and that's how information got passed down. But it's now
Yeah,
that
but
everyone's
reading. Sorry. Yes, that's right. But reading and listening are receptive skills. So when we are reading, it's some kind of receptive, receiving information. But not only reading is important when, for example, when we are learning another language or want to improve it, listening skills of listening is very important. So that's why, for example, for foreign people, it's very difficult to watch films or listen to music because they got used to more reading as they could, and there is a lack of listening. So that's why I guess it's better for them to choose a book instead of watching films when they don't know, of course, language. So as for me, I prefer books, but I am a really good moviegoer. But I'm talking about a beginner, just to tell you the truth.
yeah.
If
Lovely. I'm going to quickly go through what you've all said. Differences that books have for vocabulary. Films also. I have seen a lot of children who have learned some language by watching films and cartoon. Yeah, that's actually partly how I learned English. I used to watch Cartoon Network. Some producers change the plot story in their films. Yes. In the film, we can see how all the characters look like, and in the books, if it is not written about, the characters start thinking how the characters look like, which makes the book much more interesting. Yes, we impose our idea of how they should look. Books are longer than films. Yeah, absolutely. We've probably all been there when we've been studying for a literature exam where we've decided to watch the film and not read the book because it was a much easier thing to do. So sometimes what you read in the book is quite different from what you watch in a film. Yeah. And we'll look at exactly why that happens. Why films can often be so different from how we imagine the book to be. Books make you feel make you feel like you're in a different reality. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so this is what I think the fundamental difference comes down to. It's show versus tell, or in other words, action versus description. So what do I mean by this? With a book, when it comes to a character, it can give us the inner thoughts and perspective of a character and transition between the thoughts and perspective of the character and action in a way that's very smooth. So if I just give you a simple example, let's imagine there's a chapter in a book and it describes a robber going into a house and he has to rob this house, but he feels kind of hesitant about it. He feels kind of bad about it. The novel can depict very well how he feels by giving him this first person perspective voice, so we know what he's thinking, but it can also show us what he's doing, how he's interacting with the house, how he's burgling. Whereas a film, if it was a film version, it wouldn't be as easy to identify how the robber is feeling. You'd have to use much different techniques. You'd probably have to, I don't know, you can use lighting, sound, and the physicality of the actor to show how nervous he is. But it's a lot more showing. A film's all about showing, you see, whereas a book can give us this individual perspective much better. And I'll give you some examples to make this clear if that didn't make any sense. If we think about example one, The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games, it's a dystopian novel. If you aren't aware, it's a dystopian novel about a world where children are forced to fight for the death to entertain like the rich folk and the elites. This girl in the middle is called Katniss Everdeen. And basically in the books, there's this love triangle between Katniss Everdeen, the boy to her left is called Peter, and the boy to her right is called Gay. And all throughout the books, there's 3 books I seem to remember, she has this constant psychological struggle about who she loves more. So she's completely torn between the two. And that's described in a lot of detail, her thought process, how she feels. In the film, however, that's completely scrapped. That plot line is completely scrapped. We don't really see her being torn. Why? Because it would have been impractical to include that in the film. It would have been almost impossible. And the reason for that is because Gale actually doesn't feature in the majority of the film, at least not the first film. So I suppose the only thing they could have done was they could have had her sort of thinking out loud, but then that would have been sort of, I don't know, kind of boring, and it wouldn't have been particularly aesthetic. So that's example 1. But to give you a more detailed example, if we think about The Great Gatsby, there's a scene in The Great Gatsby where Gatsby goes to his friend's house, the narrator. And Gatsby invites Daisy to come over to the house. Now, Gatsby, his relationship with Daisy is interesting. She makes him feel very nervous. He always wants to please her. He's in love with her, etc. So what he does in the film is he orders lots of servants to bring loads of flowers to the house, to decorate it, to mow the lawn, clean everything so that the house looks perfect. And this is basically to physically show Gatsby's sort of anticipation that Daisy's coming, to show that he feels nervous, to show how much she means to him, etc. And at the same time, while he's waiting, there's this clock in the background which is ticking, and it sort of also creates this sense of anticipation, this clock. And as well as that, there's the shot changes happen very quickly. Okay, so this is the film using all the physical techniques of a film to depict how nervous he feels. Now, the interesting thing is, the book is completely different. This scene is described completely differently. In the book, there is no flowers brought, there is no mowing of the lawn, there is no clock. It's simply this. The narrator watches Gatsby and describes him in the following way. I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. Now, what's the difference here? What do you think is the key difference here? What has the book been able to do that the film couldn't? Why has the book decided not to talk about these flowers and have Gatsby bring all these servants to prepare the house? Why is the book so much more simple but as effective? Why do you think this is the case, might you say? So what we could say is that literature has the ability to use various literary techniques. So in literature, you can have poetry, you can have metaphors, similes, some pathetic fallacy, personification, etc. And what's happening here is even just the imagery of Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pocket. The very simple description of him tells us everything we need to know about how he feels. The metaphors being used, plunged like weights in his coat pocket. This gives us a sense of a man who's feeling burdened, right? As well as, whereas a film couldn't quite show that in the same way. It needs to be described in literature. And he was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. Now, there's a technique, a literary technique, a literary device called pathetic fallacy. And basically, it uses the weather or some elements of weather and nature to describe the inner feelings of a character. So standing in a puddle of water, the very imagery itself gives us a sense of someone who's feeling quite pathetic, quite low, etc. So we're starting to see key differences here. Books have all the literary devices that they can use. Films, it's a different medium. They have to use different techniques to express stuff. Right. Is there anything that anyone would like to add to that? Anything you found interesting or any questions you might have about that? If not, we can move on. Although there are times where perhaps it's not even worth adapting a book into a film. And the specific example which came to mind here was Catcher in the Rye. I'm not sure how many of you have read this book, but it's about it's a sort of coming of age story about a young man, I think he's a teenager at school, and basically he skips school and he goes on this adventure through New York, I seem to remember, sees various people and he's constantly feeling bored and trying to satisfy himself. Not much happens in the book. Let's see, we've got yeah, that's the Georgian poetry, isn't it? I haven't read it yet, but I've been told to read that. That's a good example. Yeah, so not much action actually happens in this book. He simply leaves school for the day, meets a couple of people, and then he comes back home. So what I've written here is Catcher in the Rye would not work very well as a film, as the whole novel takes place in the mind of Holden, and there is very little action going on in the movie. There's an entire scene where Holden sits on a train thinking. This would not translate very well into a film. How could you make so there's an entire chapter where Holden's sitting on a train and we're just reading his thoughts. How could you put that into a film? Sounds pretty impossible to me, to be honest. Unless you just show him on the train or you have to change something, but you can see why some books they're just not adaptable into film and therefore not worth pursuing. So can we think of any other examples of books we've read that we just think could not translate into a film? Is there, and so this Webkist Kaosani, is that an example of a book you think would not translate? Any examples of books you think that could not translate well into a film? Percy Jackson, although they did make a movie, they did make a couple of films. Pride and Prejudice. I think I saw a pretty good version of Pride and Prejudice with what's her name? She's in Pirates of the Caribbean. Kira? Perhaps, and when you write these books down, perhaps give me some reasons why you think they wouldn't translate in one sentence. I don't know, that looks like a Georgian book. Okay. So we'll move on to this idea more specifically. It is Georgian. Okay, I see. And you don't think it would translate well into a film? It should just be kept. It should be kept as a book. Fantastic Beasts. So these are probably all titles that disappointed you when you watched the film. I imagine that's why you're writing these down, because these have all got film adaptations, or at least most of them do. So I suppose these made you feel quite disappointed. Yeah, okay, I see. So we'll go into that more in a bit, specifically why films can make us feel disappointed. And sometimes they can make us feel disappointed, rightly so. But I think sometimes we also need to consider that our disappointment is kind of personal and not entirely objective. And perhaps there's some things we haven't considered. So let me move on to the next slide. Okay, so Billy Milligan's Minds can't be taken as a film because 24 people live in him, and it would be, I see. Does he have multiple personality disorder? Is that why there's 24 people living in him? Okay. Have you seen a film called Split? There's a film called Split, and it's about a guy who also has multiple different personalities living inside of him, like 50 or something. And the film's actually really successful because basically what he does is each personality gets expressed individually. So it could work, but it would definitely be hard, and it would take a lot of thinking on the part of the screenwriters how to do it, for sure. Okay, so now that we've discussed all this, the fundamental differences between action and description, let's make our own scene. So imagine there's a novel, a man has to rob a house, he feels deep regret and hesitation about what he is about to do. The novel is written from the first perspective, and we can understand his emotions and intentions clearly. So that's the hypothetical novel, the book. Now, can someone give me some suggestions about how can we represent this, but in film? Using film, how could we represent this book? How could we adapt it into a film? Any ideas? How would you shoot this scene? What would you have the man do? Where would you put your camera angles? Would there be music? Any suggestions? If not, let me give you one suggestion. So we want to be able to express that this man feels sort of deep regret and hesitation, and he's very nervous. What you could do, you could show it physically. The robber could write about his emotions in his journal. Yes. So yeah, definitely. And I suppose we get to read his journal, or there's like a voiceover that we can hear reading it out loud. I think first he'd think out loud. As in he'd speak out loud, or he'd think out loud. We could hear his thoughts. You're saying that we could hear his thoughts, probably. The issue with that is that can be slightly boring. And it's too, I don't know, it's just sort of too direct. I think first he'd think out loud. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's one thing we could do is the guy thinks out loud, oh, I really don't want to do this. But what else? What else could we do with him physically? Or with cameras and stuff like that. One suggestion, perhaps, there could be close-ups, like close shots of his face and body. It's not Indian film to think out loud. In Indian films, do they think out loud? I haven't seen many Indian films. So maybe there could be a close-up of his hand and his hand is sort of shaking. Oh, I see. Okay. So perhaps there could be a close-up of his hand and his hand is twitching, shaking, physically showing how he feels. Close-ups on his face. There could be quick scene cuts. There could be sort of foreboding music. The point is, the film would do something completely different from the book. It would have to be shown differently. Yeah. Anything we want to add? Any other interesting things you might do with this scene if you were a director? Is there anything else you might have done with this scene? If not, then we can move on. Right. So let's think about what causes problems. What is the issue? Why do you think directors and screenwriters get it wrong? And they do get it wrong. There's quite a few examples of where they've got this wrong. Why do you think that certain adaptations of books have been total failures and totally rubbish? Do you have any ideas? What causes the problem? Why do you think this happens? Any opinions here? And you can express your opinion while I'm also showing you what I think. So the first problem for me is having to appeal to a wider audience. Now, novels aren't necessarily written for everybody. There's lots of, just like films, there's lots of genres. They can be quite niche. Some people might just get put off by how big a book is, you know? So when you're making a film version and you want to make a lot of money, sometimes you need to find a way to make the story in the novel appeal to a wider audience. So that might involve changing key plot lines, changing characters, making characters more likable even when they're not supposed to be, etc. So that can be a potential problem. Another problem is just a practical problem, is fitting the film into a feature time length. So when a director is sort of told that he needs to make this film along with his screenwriters, they can't make a film over a certain amount of time. It costs more money. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but there's quite strict rules about feature time lengths when you're making a film. So that might mean you have to cut things from the book. You might have to make the story shorter. Yeah, you might lose key details from the book as a result. What some directors decide to do is, for example, I think with the last Harry Potter book, because the last Harry Potter book was so big, they decided to split it up into 2 separate feature time length movies, which was a sensible thing to do. I don't think you would have been able to fit that into one film. Okay, so the other issue is screenwriters can become lazy and don't come up with their own material. So often when a screenwriter is working from an already written book, you might be like, I don't need to do anything. I've got the whole story. I'm just simply going to replicate the story in film form. Now, that can be quite a bad thing to do because, like we agreed before, not all things can translate into films from books. But then there's a flip side to this. Sometimes screenwriters come up with too much of their own material and the soul of the novel is lost. The soul of the book is lost. So there's this constant balance for screenwriters between what do I change and what do I keep. And you can have extremes of both, I suppose. Characters don't fit their description in the novel, but rather are cast in terms of Hollywood familiarity. So quite often we can find books disappointing because films disappointing because the characters don't look like how we expected them to look. And that can be really upsetting sometimes. Sometimes directors change main moral of the book in films. They sure do. They sure do. And I will come on to that into a moment, definitely, where a director has imposed their own sort of ideas and philosophies onto a book. Okay, so examples of, let's begin with Ender's Game. I'm not sure how many of you have read this. Ender's Game is essentially, the story is there's a huge alien fleet that's meant to be attacking Earth, and Earth decides to turn to its children because children are smarter and more creative or something, and Ender, this boy, is meant to solve the war tactics, and generally he's a genius and they want him to defeat the aliens. Now in the book, Ender is 6 years old, as you can see on the left, whereas on the right in the film he's about 15, which is it's a huge difference for people, and it made people really upset. But then on the other hand, I was thinking about this and I thought it looked kind of silly if you had a 6-year-old playing a genius who's like killing people and stuff. I don't know. So that's something to consider. And then another example is the graphic novel Ghost in the Shell, which is a Japanese anime. When they made the film version, they didn't cast a Japanese woman, they cast a Caucasian woman, i.e. Scarlett Johansson. And people found that deeply upsetting as well, because it seems weird that you would cast a white American woman in the role of a Japanese android. And some people found that sort of, some people accused this film of cultural appropriation and that it was disrespecting Japanese culture and that it wasn't casting Japanese people to play this character. Now, that might be the reason why that might have happened is, I suppose, if you have Scarlett Johansson playing the main character in any film, it's obviously going to get more attention. Perhaps it will make it more popular. It's quite interesting. There's actually a video of a man going around Japan, American chap. He's a sort of journalist, and he just goes around to people in the streets and he asks them, "What do you think about the new Ghost in the Shell movie?" And it seems all the Japanese people loved it, and they didn't really have a problem with the fact that Scarlett Johansson isn't Japanese. But anyway, you guys can make your own mind up on that one. So we've got these various problems. Let's think about how can screenwriters improve? How can they make these sort of books better? How can they improve? What do we think? How could they improve? Any suggestions? How can we make adaptations better? What do we think? Any ideas at all? Okay, so let me just begin with the first one. Take out dialogue that doesn't work for the story. So this is me assessing the first point about screenwriters getting lazy. They shouldn't include everything. It doesn't make sense to include everything, and cut out the things that just don't contribute anything to the film. Understand characters and their motivations rather than giving them updated PC attitudes. So I think someone mentioned this earlier. Sometimes directors change the main moral of the book. And I suppose in this modern day climate of cultural sensitivity and political correctness, lots of books have to be changed so that they're more, let's just say, appropriate. So this isn't an example of a book being made into a film, but it's the same principle here. They're releasing the new Mulan film quite soon, and Mulan was originally a cartoon, and in the cartoon version, Mulan, the story roughly, it's about a woman who dresses up as a man to represent her father in battle, and I think it's set in China. And in the story, Mulan falls in love with this general, her superior. Now, what the film versions decided to do is they felt uncomfortable with the idea that Mulan has a relationship with a man where there's a power imbalance. And they sort of, for some reason, the screenwriters thought that was really uncomfortable. So they've decided to get completely rid of the character of, I think it's called Shane, the man Mulan falls in love with in the cartoon. They've completely gotten rid of his character. So that's sort of as a result of the changing cultural climate. It's your favorite movie. It's a really good cartoon. It's about girls' power. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, of course. sort of proto-feministic storyline. I love Mulan, definitely, but I don't see the need to change the characters like they're changing the characters. But yeah, so it's really important that screenwriters, they don't lose, that they understand the characters and that they don't lose the motivation of the characters. So even I didn't like the new Incredibles movie, the second Incredibles movie, because I just feel like it was not the same characters as in the first movie. Like it just wasn't well considered. I feel like, I don't know, Mr. Incredible, like he had nothing to say. There was nothing interesting about his character, no character arc. So it's really important you get your characters right. And for me, this is the most important thing that any screenwriter or any director should do when they're making an adaptation. Include the author. Absolutely include the author as part of the screenplay team, or at least have them as an advisor. Because the fundamental source of a novel is its author. No one understands the purpose, soul, intention of a novel better than the author. That is perhaps why the Harry Potter series was so successful, was because J.K. Rowling was completely involved with the screenplay team and was constantly advising the director about how the director should direct the film, what the characters should look like. I think we can all agree people are pretty satisfied with the Harry Potter films. They've been a great success. Likewise, with TV shows like Game of Thrones, one of the things that made Game of Thrones so successful was that J.R.R. Martin was completely involved with, he was on set a lot of the time. He was even advising the actors how they should act, how they should speak, etc. He was very much involved. But what do you know? The moment that Game of Thrones caught up with J.R.R. Martin's writing and was no longer able to take source material from J.R.R. Martin, then the show started to suck, in my opinion. I thought it got really bad, especially that last season. I think a lot of people really didn't like that season, and that's partly because J.R.R. Martin was not involved. He wasn't even involved in the story writing, nothing. And that's why the story just lacked soul, it lacked energy, no character development, and everything felt kind of rushed. I don't know if you agree with me. Perhaps you disagree with me. If you disagree with me, please tell me, and I'd be interested to know what you have to say. Yeah? Okay. It's always a good ego boost when people agree with you. Right. Okay. Let's see how we're doing. Oh no, I'm not watching that film. It's +20. I see. Yes. Perhaps don't watch it if you're underage. Okay, so our next session will take place on, actually just before we go there, is there anything else anyone would like to say? Any questions about films, books? Not? Let's move on to what's happening next week. Some authors write uninteresting books and some people want to make it better. Can you think of any examples of that? My favorite book is probably Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And I will never watch the film version because it might really upset me. So I'd rather just reread that book a couple more times. So yeah, Nutze, you said you had an example perhaps of a boring book that could be made into an interesting film. I mean, there are a lot of examples of where the film has been considered much better than the book. So, for example, 2001: Space Odyssey. A lot of people don't know that that film is actually based on a book. That's Stanley Kubrick's 2001: Space Odyssey, and it's considered one of the greatest sci-fi films of all time. For example, in an original Nutcracker, everyone dies and it lasts 5 hours. Yeah, and in the film version, I'm guessing not everyone dies, and that's why you like it. Sure. I mean, to be honest, all Alice in Wonderland, or the book is pretty good. The book is pretty good for Alice in Wonderland, I have to say. You don't find Alice in Wonderland interesting? Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, no, it's I just find that the film really weird. What's the director's name of Alice in Wonderland? And it's got Johnny Depp. Oh no, you said about the Nutcracker. I see. Okay. Yeah. Okay. What about favorite books? What are your favorite books? Mine's Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. What kind of books do you guys like? What would you consider your favorite book? Okay. If not, let me tell you what's happening next week. So our next talk will happen on Monday, the 23rd of March at 4 p.m. And we will be looking at this book. I'll be discussing some of the ideas in this book. It's called Homo Deus, Future of Humankind. If any of you have read Sapiens, this is by the same author. It's on Monday, the 23rd of March. It says it on the slide. And this will be generally discussing, you're welcome, we'll be discussing human evolution, human ideology, how it's developed, and where we're heading. So we'll be sort of talking about individualism versus collectivism, technologies, etc. So perhaps I will try basically sum up this book, and then perhaps it might make you want to read it. Sapiens is very good. Sapiens is the book before this, so if you get a chance to read that. I think we might have it on bookshop.g, our company website, but I'm not sure about that. Quickly, I'll just go through I've just received your favorite books. Hunger Games for Nick, likes the Hunger Games. The Last Olympian, which is the Percy Jackson series, I think. I like detectives like Sherlock Holmes, yeah, Sherlock Holmes is great. The Penderwicks, I haven't heard, that rings a bell, but I don't think I've heard that one. Okay, nice. And just if you found this webinar interesting, this idea of book versus film, we've got some of these books on bookshop.g, and all of these books, I believe, have film adaptations. The Good Liar has an it's about to have a film adaptation. It's about to be released, and it seems to have a very good cast. 13 Reasons Why was adapted into a TV show. But yeah, you might find it interesting to read it and see how it compares. It can be interesting to see how these books compare. These are all available on bookshop.g. I particularly recommend 13 Reasons Why, gripping psychological thriller. All right, and lastly, if you have any questions or you want to know what my source material was for this webinar, if you want me to reference you any books, simply send me your email and we'll be in contact with you, and we can answer, any further questions that you have. Thank you for your participation today, and have a lovely rest of your day, and perhaps you can all enjoy the sunshine on the balconies and have a relaxing time. Thank you so much, and I will say adieu.